Gentlemen, and welcome back to SF Live. I'm your host, Myrna Lim. Thank you for joining us tonight. Again, it's the political season. We have to vote on November 6th. There's a slew of ballot measures and initiatives in San Francisco, and most of us have not really tuned in with what's in front of us. Mind you, most of these ballot measures and initiatives will affect our pocketbooks. So it's time to pay attention. And guess what we have here tonight? We have Chris Miller, who is a national political radio show host, who would tell us about these measures and maybe some of the candidates that she thinks might be worth mentioning. Well, good evening, Chris. How are you doing?
Good evening. I'm fantastic.
Welcome.
And thank you so
You're
much for
looking
having
gorgeous
me.
as usual.
Yeah, I'm half asleep, but I'm ready to go. At least my brain's still functioning. I don't think I have too many neurons misfiring today. So
No, you look wonderful.
Great to see you again.
Oh, great. So let's talk about. Okay, where do you want to go? What do you want to start with?
So basically, just to give viewers a little bit of background, as you said, I have a national political radio show. I'm a radio show host.
Awesome.
On a show called Political Vixen with Chris Miller.
Wow!
But we actually, in spite of the title, it's it's kind of we do have a little bit of political satire, but most of what we talk about is very serious national political issue commentary.
Okay.
For instance, last Thursday we had on the New York Times main political reporter that is covering the presidential election live from the RNC.
Wow.
And yesterday I had an executive director on from a national healthcare reform organization,
Wow,
a very large
okay.
PAC out of Chicago, Illinois. So, most of what we talk about are statewide issues. But as you know, I'm active locally here in San Francisco, very active.
And
mostly in the education side.
Exactly. You had an initiative that lost by
Right,
50 votes.
by 115 votes. And you know what? We're going to go another round, and this time we're going to kick the pants off of the opposition. We actually had the teachers union come in 2 months before the election, before the actual election last November,
Right.
and poured a ton of money that came from teachers' dues into
As you can tell, you're very passionate
a
about
parent-led campaign against. So basically, it was supporting neighborhood schools and allowing families to go to school near their homes.
Okay, let's talk about the
Sure.
national scene.
Sure.
Because I think that what's going to happen, and tell me if I'm wrong
Sure.
on this, but I think that the atmosphere nationally is such that a lot of people are hurting economically.
Sure.
Jobs is a key issue. Jobs is number one for me, my family, my
Sure,
friends.
absolutely.
for
And
everybody,
taxation.
that I
Sure.
know. It's our pocketbooks. It's the lack of money. It's
Mm-hmm.
just the scarce resources for money, and which affects the lack of opportunities
Right.
for kids to get good education
Sure.
and new graduates good jobs. So, okay, let's talk about the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. You were
Sure.
talking about friends
Absolutely.
you brought into the RNC convention, and now
Right,
we
right.
have the Democratic Party convention.
So I have quite a few friends on both sides, and
Right.
obviously I'm fairly neutral in my radio show. In fact,
Right.
although I'm a conservative, whatever that means when you're a San Francisco
In
Republican.
San Francisco, everybody's conservative.
Well, no,
I'm not sure.
definitely not. So I will. Well, I wish that was the case.
Well, everybody's considered conservative if you do not total lie, so to speak.
Right, exactly. So a lot of our guests that come on are actually pretty liberal. So I like
Right.
that. I like to have that balance. And a lot of what I'm hearing right now is just, and from on a national level and also on a statewide level here in California, there is a whole lot of just complete disdain for partisanship
Right.
and sitting politicians that are incumbents running for re-election, and
Right.
Obama falls under that category. He
Exactly.
falls under that category for, I feel, a number of reasons. And I'm not a
Right.
huge fan of either candidate, but obviously I'm supporting Mitt Romney as a conservative. I do wish that we had a stronger candidate. But I have some serious problems with our current president, lack of follow-through, making excuses for not following through on quite a few promises that were made about 4 years ago when he was running for election his first term. And I think this really just speaks to a lack of political experience. I mean, he really did have a lack of experience when he came in. But on the heels of a second Bush presidency, which was such a disaster, anyone could have gotten elected from the Democratic Party.
Right.
So I think at this point, voters are going to hold him much more accountable given his track record
Right.
and the lack of follow through in a lot of the things that he's
Right.
done and things he's focused on that he probably shouldn't have.
Mm-hmm.
And regardless of what's coming out in the media, there is a huge problem still with jobs. I do not feel
Yeah.
that we are out of our recession. I
No,
feel that
actually,
to
this-
some degree, we may be coming out of it, and just because it's not as bad as it was at the beginning of his term doesn't mean that we're coming out of the recession. So I think that the reason for the 50-50 split, for the most part, it's been flipping back and forth every couple weeks, and now it looks like Romney's he's pretty far ahead.
Oh, really?
And not only funding and campaign funding, but also in the poll numbers. But we'll see what happens. It's RNC, and then we go to the DNC, and those numbers
How many
shift.
days do we have left? Let me see.
How many days?
Do we have less than 2 months?
We're getting down to the wire there on 2 months. We have about 2 months left.
Less than 60 days.
And this is when you start to really notice. But the thing is, as an incumbent sitting president, Obama should be much further ahead in the polls right now.
Right.
And I think one of the reasons that he isn't is I think taxpayers and voters are actually going to start to hold current politicians accountable.
Right.
So Obama kind of becomes the known evil, and then Mitt Romney's the unknown evil. So there's this whole kind of voter mindset there, and I think voters are starting to get past partisanship for the first time in quite a few decades, just because they're sick and tired of where they're at, and where they're taxpayers' dollars are being allocated improperly.
Well, speaking of taxes, we have an initiative in California.
We have quite a few actually that focus on taxation.
To raise the sales taxes.
That's right.
And they're not calling it sales tax. They're coining it with. What are they calling it? It's
pretty bad. So I'm not sure if you're talking about. So one of them is the.
Unfortunately, my favorite politician, Governor Jerry Brown,
which is my most unfavorite politician. So we could have an interesting conversation about
I have a soft spot for
Governor
him,
Moonbeam.
but I don't like. Well, I like. He was kind of a renegade at some time.
Yeah. But he's
I like renegades.
Speaking of unpopular opinions, he's not doing too well right now.
I know,
as
but
far
I
as
hate the
public opinion is
fact
concerned.
the sales taxes is really.
So let's talk about that a little bit. So we have Prop 30 here in California.
That's it, right.
We have Prop 32 as well, Prop 31. So we have quite a few, as you said, on a federal level and a statewide level. People really need to pay attention. Voters need to pay attention. Voters need to go out and vote.
Exactly.
Because there's some pretty significant legislation, not only on the federal side, but in the state of California. I mean, we're already looking at one of the highest sales taxes in the nation.
Exactly.
And they're looking at raising it. And we are also looking at one of the highest state income taxes in the nation, and they're proposing raising that pretty significantly. So Prop 30, it's the temporary taxes. Well, by temporary, it's quite a few years.
Yeah.
And that's very unusual that they chose that particular verbiage. But
and when they say temporary, sunset,
what makes
me once you get used to it, it's like
no. Well, what this is basically it's the California legislature's way of getting a very significant tax in and keeping it there.
Exactly.
It's very similar to here in San Francisco when they were proposing that illegal immigrants with children in public schools should be able to vote in school board elections. That was a stepping stone to other things. So for those of us involved in politics, you kind of see where it's going before it happens, and in a lot of cases, voters would not know that. They don't have access to that information. So Prop 30, this is the other piece that makes me upset about this piece of legislation is they're saying it's a temporary tax to fund education. Of course, anytime they tack education on it. Right, so we should give, millions of dollars more, which I believe it yields about $6 million, which is nothing in the scheme of things given what they're doing. And basically it's a Robin Hood taxation.
But it doesn't really, from what I understand, the measure itself is not earmarked. It's not the
No, it is. It is 89%. I believe it's 89% of the revenue from this will be going to K through 12 public schools, and then 11% will go to community colleges. And as you know, we have a huge issue with our community colleges needing a bailout to even continue running here in San Francisco. Right. I believe it is earmarked, and I believe that's the percentage. So, and also increases in sales and use tax by 1/4 cent for 4 years. So one fundamental issue that I have with this, and there's a couple more. There's Prop 31 as well.
How is this different? How is this different from Prop 31?
So basically, this is a temporary tax, but it's a 4-year tax. That's a pretty significant taxation. And again, just so voters are aware, in all likelihood, this is a taxation that will continue. This is the legislature's way of getting it in. And what they're doing is, hey, bail our state out. Barbara Boxer, Jerry Brown, Dianne Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi, bail our state out because these, sitting politicians, career politicians that have been here forever, who have screwed up our budget, are basically asking voters to take it in the pocketbook. They're asking for a bailout from voters.
Exactly.
And one thing I've never understood, and in our last round we had, I believe, voters raised their vehicle registration. Again, we are one of the highest vehicle registrations in the nation.
I mean, what happens?
But what's so hard to figure out when you're looking at a piece of legislation? You're being taxed further.
Well, a lot of it, it's called, when you talk about creative accounting, this is like creative legislation. It's like when they word it on ballot arguments.
Oh, but it's going to education, so of course I'm going to support it, right?
It's the spin and the marketing.
Exactly. And voters need to, voters are pissed off right now. They need to start becoming aware. They need to start
being hit in the pocketbook
of what's actually going on, because you know what, voters are voting to have their own taxes their own taxes raised. So basically Prop 31 establishes a 2-year state budget cycle, which is great in essence. So the problem is, you look at a piece of legislation and there's all these different things it entails.
Right.
When you really look at the meat of it, what's happening and where the money's being allocated, that's where we have a problem. And we have a big problem with that here in California, and that's why we're in the position we're in right now.
Right.
A lack of accountability within our state legislature. As you brought up Jerry Brown, I know he's someone that you have an affinity for, but Jerry Brown's a huge part of the problem. and he's having to take responsibility for it now, and that can't be a great position
but
to be in.
The thing is, he's an insider. He's been in it, and I think I'm starting to realize that people in his position, unfortunately, do not really know what's going on in the bureaucracy, about how the bureaucracy is actually working for or against them. I think that's what happens. They look at the big picture, but as far as the day-to-day management of the organization, of the state, how departments work, how agencies work, he gets like the Excel spreadsheet, but he doesn't know
which is great
what's behind the numbers.
But another big problem is, look, we're looking at a huge need on a national level and on a statewide level for pension reform. And this is something he's not a huge fan of. I mean, we're going to end up like Vallejo, completely bankrupt. And this state is, the thing that I don't understand is, voters need to understand it's dire now. We're in a position right now as a state where we have to do something about it. The problem is, we're not paying more in taxes and more in sales tax, and decreasing the quality of life in a place that's already very difficult to stay in, because our state legislature doesn't want to take responsibility for lack of accountability within their spending.
Well, look at San Francisco. I mean, I was just reviewing the measures. Practically every single one of them is a tax. Every single one of the initiatives takes money from the public.
Well, and again, we have a big issue too. You and I were talking about this beforehand. Is this bond measure for the park and rec here in San Francisco? Well, that's great and everything, but when we had a bond for education passed the last 2 times, we still haven't paid back the initial bond before the second bond was passed this last November. But voters need to be aware of what they're voting for. Just because it looks like something good, I'd rather have a voter not vote than vote without doing their homework. And it takes 15 minutes to look over the detail behind it. You go into the Department of Elections for State of California. You go into the Secretary of State website and go into the ballot initiatives. It's so simple.
The general revenue bond measure for the parks is $195 million. But the thing is,
people don't realize, taxpayers, we pay those bonds back. It's not free money.
Did we just have a parks bond not long ago?
We did. I believe it was last ago. I think we had one on the ballot actually this last November. It was either June or November.
So they keep on just talking about
they were asking for more money for things like streets, which obviously we need, but then they were also putting in into that same piece of legislation that it could be spent on planting more trees. The hilarious part about that is, the last bond measure that planted more trees, we actually don't have the funding to even keep up those trees. So they're asking to so basically they're asking voters to perpetuate, a whole lot of bad decision making by our leaders, or lack thereof, here in San Francisco, in the state of California, and on a federal level. Another thing I want to bring up real quick is Prop 32, which I am actually a huge fan of. And as you know, I have a huge problem with the unions, labor unions, etc. And there was a recent New York Times article talking about the spend within the political realm, super PACs, and basically taking the money that is mandatory from these hardworking, individuals within many different labor unions, and most of it's going towards political campaigns, which is ridiculous. And I think that's another area that needs some serious reform, and it needs to stop happening. It needs to be discontinued. So Prop 32, I'm a huge fan of basically political contributions to candidates by payroll deduction. It prohibits unions from using payroll deducted funds for political purposes, and the same applies to corporations and government contractors, which is a huge thing. And there's a couple other reform measures included in Prop 32 that are great. One of the big ones that I'm a huge fan of is that anyone in a position with the government is not allowed to contribute to certain political campaigns. It's a conflict of interest. It's ridiculous.
That's true.
And we need to bring some accountability and transparency to not only our statewide government, but also on a federal level. This is a huge, huge problem. Exactly. And I think the unions are really going to start seeing from voters that are becoming aware of what's going on. I mean, even their union members, I mean, they're supporting this. So when they're, hey, we're okay with having, union dues deducted, but we want to have some accountability and say in where our money's being spent. Same thing's going on with taxpayers right now. I think that this is becoming a very, this is becoming
I think the
much
problem,
more prevalent with voters.
The problem that's happening right now is that the government, all of these tax measures,
right,
on federal, state, and local level just shows just a sheer lack of creativity, know-how, and wherewithal on the part of public officials about how to create money, how to make revenue, because they don't realize. And
they screw the taxpayers when they haven't been held accountable for the way that they spend the money that they do have.
The problem is, a lot of these public officials have never started or ran a business. They don't realize that small businesses, you invest everything in your life, your savings, your 401k, and so on and so forth to start this business. You wake up in the middle of the night thinking, how am I going to make a run for this business? You think of creative ways to market, to make your products more desirable for people, and to collaborate and do all of that stuff. And a lot of these public officials don't know that. They figure,
and I'll tell you something too. A lot of them have never worked in the private sector, which is why I support candidates who have worked in the private sector, because you're used to then being in an environment where there is accountability.
Exactly.
And there's no smoke and mirrors. There's look, this is our budget. This is what it's being spent on. This is what needs to change. Performance, etc. And that's not an accountability that we have in the public sector that we have on the government side. So we have another proposition in California is Prop 38. It's a tax to fund education and early childhood programs. So again, anytime they put
is that the competing measure by Molly Munger or something?
You mean Charles?
I don't know. There is supposed to be a competing measure.
So it's a tax to fund early and or education and early childhood programs. It increases personal income tax rates on annual earnings over, I believe it's like 7,300, something like that, using a sliding scale of 0.4% for lowest individual earners. So it's crazy too if you read it. It's so incredibly convoluted. It's almost impossible for anyone that's voting on this to understand it. But it provides K through 12 funds on school specific, like per pupil basis. It sounds great. It increases state personal income tax revenues from 2013 through 2024, which is a significant period of time of 9 years, a 9-year cycle. The increase would bring roughly $10 billion in the 2013 to 2014. When you look at the numbers, it's like when we talked about Prop 30, it only brings in $6 million annually. When in the grand scheme of things, given where we're at from a debt expenditure perspective, it's absolutely ridiculous. So that's great, but my big issue with that is, we shouldn't be cutting funding to schools and teachers shouldn't be losing their jobs. The problem is, again, in our leadership, the way that the funds are being spent that are already there, I disagree with, and I think a lot of voters do as well. That's my concern. So we're taxing, it's taxation for the purpose of putting money into education, which is great, but just like, San Francisco here, we have a general fund, and the way that they're spending the money is atrocious. So do we want to increase already exorbitant taxes here in San Francisco, which are completely ridiculous and which deplete the quality of life for people living here, but to what end?
Well, the annoying thing to me is how the kids are always being used.
Absolutely.
It's always education.
Absolutely.
But what about the general fund money? What's happening? What are you doing with the money in the general fund that you're not using the money for schools and education? And especially right now, if you look at education, a lot of these kids are graduating from college. There's no jobs out there.
No, and that's the way it's going to be for quite some time, and unless we start electing people that understand that and understand that there's some accountability there, and this is becoming a huge problem in our quality of life and the way we live. So to your point, so we'll get into candidates a little bit because I know we just have a little while, but I really would compel voters to not only
wait a second. Gross receipts tax. Okay, there's a gross receipts tax in San Francisco.
Sure.
It amends the tax code, but I was trying to read through it and I'm not clear as to what's going on there, because they're saying that a certain percentage of gross receipts will be subject to tax, something in the range of 0.075% to 0.65%, and supposedly, allegedly, it then would reduce the appropriate payroll taxes.
Right.
But the ballot itself is just not clear as to how that formula
that's
is
a
going to
shocker.
work.
Right, and they do that for a reason. They want legislation to be passed, so they make it so incredibly convoluted that it's
Right.
almost impossible for voters to understand what they're even voting on.
Okay, we don't have a lot of time left, so talk about candidates. You have
Sure.
a minute and...
Absolutely.
10
So
seconds.
basically, here in San Francisco, I follow candidates pretty
Right.
closely, and I sit down and meet with candidates and their campaign managers. So there are actually a couple of in our supervisorial race, and also
Who do you like?
Community Colleges Board.
Okay.
So and this is a pretty interesting. It's becoming kind of a contentious race because a couple of the incumbents that are running for re-election are becoming very unpopular with voters.
Okay, you have 40 seconds. Who?
Same thing as on a national level. So
All right, start
basically,
naming names.
District 7 supervisorial candidate Mike Garcia,
Okay.
extremely sharp, amazing education background, fantastic background in the regulatory field. So
Okay.
he's definitely someone to look at.
Okay.
David Lee running against Eric Marr, who's my district supervisor in
Okay.
District 1. I am not a fan of Eric Marr.
Okay.
So, but this is another thing that voters need to be aware of. Hold
Right.
your current political leadership accountable when
Okay.
you're voting on candidates. So I just got off the phone with one of
All
David
right, well,
Lee's.
there you go. So, Chris Miller, ladies and gentlemen,
Sure.
thank you so much. And 5 seconds as usual.
No worries,
Thank you,
no worries.
and we'll have you again. Good night.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for